The Roman Empire conquered Britain in 43 AD. Within decades, legions had swept across the lowlands, crushing every tribe in their path. The most powerful military force the world had ever seen, and they took England in a matter of months. Except they didn't conquer Britain, because Wales said no. For 30 more years, Rome's legions threw themselves against the mountains of western Britain. They lost entire cohorts in narrow valleys. They watched their supply lines vanish into mist. They fought enemies who refused to stand and fight, who melted into forests and reappeared behind them, who knew every cave and every pass and every way to make an empire bleed. Wales held out for 3 decades against a force that conquered the Mediterranean world. And in a sense, it never truly fell at all. This is the story of how the smallest nation in Britain became the hardest place on earth to conquer. Today, Wales covers just over 8,000 square miles. That's smaller than Massachusetts. You could drive from the English border to the western coast in a couple of hours. On a map, it looks like nothing, a small bump on the side of Britain, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. But maps lie. Maps flatten mountains into colors. Maps turn 3-dimensional nightmares into 2-dimensional abstractions. A map of Wales doesn't show you what the Romans saw when they marched west in 47 AD. They saw walls, not walls built by men, walls built by time and pressure and the relentless grinding of ice. The Cambrian mountains run down the spine of Wales like a clenched fist, rising to 3,000 feet in places where no road can pass. Snowdonia in the north reaches higher still, with peaks that scrape the clouds and valleys so narrow that a dozen men could hold them against thousands. The highest point is Snowdon itself, called Gwyllwydfa in Welsh, rising 3,560 feet above sea level. From its summit, you can see Ireland on a clear day. But clarity is rare in Snowdonia. The mountains make their own weather. Clouds roll in without warning. Rain falls sideways. Mist can reduce visibility to 10 feet in minutes. The Romans were the greatest siege engineers in history. They could take any city, breach any wall, destroy any fortification their enemies could build. They had conquered civilizations from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Germania. But you cannot besiege a mountain, you cannot starve out a cliff face, you cannot negotiate with geography. And Wales was made of geography. To understand what the Romans faced, imagine the terrain. Glaciers carved Snowdonia into a maze of Sirius vivams and arets, rounded valleys scooped from living rock, knife-edge ridges connecting peaks that offered no shelter and no mercy. The Llanberis Pass cuts through the mountains like a wound, barely wide enough for 2 chariots, overlooked by heights where a handful of men with rocks could slaughter an army. The Nantes-Francon Pass is even narrower, its walls rising sheer on both sides, a perfect killing ground for anyone who understood how to use it. And the Welsh understood. They had been living here for centuries before the Romans came. They knew which passes flooded in the spring. They knew which trails vanished under winter snow. They knew where to hide when the legions came and where to strike when the legions left. The people who lived here called themselves the Silures in the south and the Ordovices in the north. Roman writers describe the Silurics as fierce and warlike, with dark complexions and curly hair, possibly descended from settlers who had crossed from Iberia in ancient times. The Ordovices controlled Snowdonia itself, the mountain heartland that no invader had ever penetrated. And they had a leader who understood how to fight an empire. Caratacus was a king who had already lost his kingdom in the southeast of Britain. When the Romans landed in 43 AD, he led a resistance in what is now Kent and Sussex. When that resistance failed, he didn't surrender. He fled west into the mountains and began organizing the Welsh tribes for a war that would last decades. Caratacus understood something fundamental about asymmetric warfare. He couldn't beat Roman legions in open battle. Roman infantry was simply too disciplined, too well equipped, too numerous. But he didn't need to win battles. He needed to make the war too expensive to continue. For years, he waged a campaign of ambush and retreat, of hit-and-run strikes that bled Rome's forces without ever risking a decisive engagement. Roman supply convoys disappeared on mountain roads. Isolated patrols never returned to camp. Soldiers sent to gather firewood found themselves surrounded by enemies who vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The Romans called it guerrilla warfare. The Welsh called it survival. In 47 AD, the Roman governor Publius Ostorius Scapula marched his legions into Wales. He expected a quick victory. He had crushed resistance in eastern Britain. He had the numbers, the training, the equipment. What he didn't have was a way through the mountains. The campaign against the Silures dragged on for years. Legions would advance, take casualties in ambushes, retreat to resupply, and advance again. They built forts, but the forts required constant reinforcement. They cut roads, but the roads became targets. They won skirmishes, but the enemy refused to be destroyed. The Silures were particularly relentless. One account records that they ambushed and wiped out an entire Roman cavalry unit, then distributed the captured horses and armor to their allies. Another describes Roman soldiers being picked off one by one as they marched through valleys that offered no place to form battle lines. The legions were trained to fight in formation. The Welsh refused to let them. In 51 AD, Caratacus finally risked a set-piece battle. He chose his ground carefully, a hillside in the borderlands, where the terrain would negate Roman advantages. But something went wrong. His position was stormed, his wife and daughter captured, his forces scattered. Caratacus fled north to the Brigantids, hoping for refuge. The queen of the Brigantes, Cartimandua, had made peace with Rome. She handed Caratacus over in chains. He was taken to Rome itself, paraded through the streets, and brought before Emperor Claudius. According to Roman historians, Caratacus spoke so eloquently about his resistance that Claudius was moved to spare his life. He lived out his days in Rome, celebrity prisoner, a symbol of the unconquerable spirit that had cost the empire so dearly. The Welsh resistance should have collapsed without him. It didn't. For another 27 years, the Silures and Ordovices fought on. Governors came and went. Some died in office, worn down by the endless campaign. Others achieved temporary victories, only to watch their gains evaporate the moment they looked away. In 58 AD, a new governor named Quintus Veranius arrived with fresh legions and ambitious plans. He died within a year, his campaign incomplete. His successor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, pushed all the way to Anglesey by 60 AD, slaughtering the Druids who had made the island their sanctuary. But while he was occupied in the west, a queen named Boudica raised a rebellion in the east that nearly destroyed Roman Britain entirely. The Welsh watched, waited, and resumed their attacks when Paulinus withdrew. It wasn't until 74 AD that Rome established a permanent fortress at Isca, modern-day Caerleon, in Silures territory. The fortress held 5,000 legionaries, a permanent occupation force designed to crush any further resistance. Even then, the Ordovices in the north remained defiant. Their final defeat came in 78 AD, when the governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola led a campaign that finally broke the last organized resistance. Agricola's tactics were brutal. He pursued the Ordovices into their mountain strongholds, killed their warriors, burned their crops, and demonstrated that there was no sanctuary the legions could not reach. 31 years. That's how long it took the Roman Empire to conquer an area smaller than some Italian provinces. The Emperor Claudius had invaded Britain, expecting easy glory. His successors inherited a war that consumed legions and governors and treasure without end. And even then, conquest was a generous word. Rome built roads and forts and bathhouses. They established towns like Caerleon, Carmarthen, and Cardiff. But the mountains remained beyond their control. Roman maps of Wales are notably vague. Roman records of the interior are notably thin. The empire held the coastline and the valleys, but Snowdonia remained a world apart. The language of the Welsh survived, their customs survived, their identity survived. 4 centuries of Roman occupation left surprisingly few traces in Welsh culture. The Romans came, the Romans stayed, and eventually the Romans left. In 410 AD, the last legions withdrew from Britain. The Welsh were still there. But Rome was only the first empire to break itself against Wales. In the 8th century, a new power dominated Britain, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, under King Offa, stretched from the English Channel to the Humber River. Offa was one of the most powerful rulers in early medieval Europe. He corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal. His silver pennies circulated across the continent. His kingdom controlled most of lowland England, and he built a wall to keep out the Welsh. Offa's Dyke runs for 149 miles along the border between England and Wales. In places, the earthwork reached 60 feet wide and 8 feet high, with a deep ditch on the Welsh side. The labor required was immense, comparable to the great works of Roman engineering. Entire armies must have been put to work digging, carrying, building. It wasn't defensive in the traditional sense. It wasn't meant to stop armies. An 8-foot embankment wouldn't slow a determined invasion force. What it was meant to do was mark a boundary, to say, this is where our world ends. We are not going any further. Think about what that means. The most powerful king in Britain looked at Wales and decided that conquest wasn't worth the cost. The mountains, the valleys, the endless resistance had taught the Anglo-Saxons the same lesson the Romans had learned 3 centuries earlier. Wales could not be held. For 300 more years, the Welsh maintained their independence. Kingdoms rose and fell. Princes fought each other as often as they fought the English. But the border held. Offa's Dyke marked the limit of Anglo-Saxon ambition, and for generations, no English king seriously challenged it. Then the Normans arrived. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy defeated King Harold at Hastings and claimed the English crown. Within 5 years, the Normans had conquered England from north to south, replacing the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with French-speaking lords. William the Conqueror broke every center of resistance with a brutality that emptied the entire regions. The north of England was so thoroughly devastated that it took over a century to recover. Then he looked at Wales. The Norman conquest of Wales began in 1067. It would take over 200 years to complete, and even then, complete was optimistic. The Normans didn't march into Wales and take it. They inched forward, building castles as they went, losing ground whenever they turned their attention elsewhere. The numbers tell the story. Wales has over 600 recorded castles, more per square mile than any other country in the world. This isn't because the Welsh loved fortifications, it's because the conquerors needed them. Every valley required a garrison. Every pass required a strong point. Every gate had to be locked in stone because the moment the soldiers left, the Welsh would take it back. The March Lords, as the Norman rulers of the borderlands were called, spent generations fighting for scraps of territory. They took the lowlands, the river valleys, the accessible coastal plains. They built castle after castle, each one a small island of control in an ocean of resistance. But the mountains remained beyond reach. The Welsh princes retreated into Snowdonia and ruled from fortresses that no siege could reduce. Gwynedd, the kingdom of northwest Wales, became the heart of Welsh resistance. Its princes controlled the mountain passes, collected the loyalty of the Highland clans, and waited for opportunities to strike back. Prince after prince held out against Norman encroachment. Gruffudd ap Cynan rebuilt Gwynedd after years of chaos. His son, Owain Glyndwr, expanded its power until it rivaled any Norman lordship. Each generation learned from the last. Each generation found new ways to resist. And in 1258, a prince named Llywelyn ap Gruffudd united enough of Wales to call himself Prince of Wales and demand recognition from the English crown. For the first time since the Roman invasion, most of Wales acknowledged a single native ruler. For a moment, it looked like Wales might emerge as an independent nation. Then came Edward I. Edward was different from his predecessors. He had money, he had patience, and he had a plan. In 1277, he invaded Wales with the largest army England had fielded in generations. 35,000 men, including over 15,000 infantry and 800 knights, converged on Gwynedd from multiple directions. Edward didn't try to fight Llywelyn in the mountains. He'd learned from the failures of his predecessors. Instead, he starved him out. English ships blocked the coast, cutting off grain imports from Ireland. English troops sealed the mountain passes. Farmers couldn't harvest their fields, cattle couldn't be moved to market. Llywelyn's people began to starve. By autumn, the prince had no choice. He submitted. But submission didn't last. The English officials who arrived to administer Wales were corrupt, brutal, and contemptuous of Welsh law. Resentment built for 5 years. In 1282, Llywelyn's brother Dyke launched a revolt. Llywelyn joined him. For a year, the Welsh held out against everything Edward could throw at them. The war was savage on both sides. Edward's troops burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and demolished anything that could give the rebels shelter. The Welsh struck back with ambushes, raids, and targeted killings of English officials. The mountains ran with blood. Then, on December 11th, 1282, Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish near Birth Wells. The circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts say he was lured into a trap by a lord he trusted. Others say he simply stumbled into an English patrol. What's certain is that he died, and his head was sent to London, where it was displayed on a pike at a tower and crowned with ivy in mockery of a Welsh prophecy. Dyke fought on for another 8 months. He was captured in June 1283, the first person in recorded history to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment invented specifically for him and later applied to countless others. Wales had fallen, but Edward knew that fall and stayed fallen were different things. What followed was the most ambitious castle building program in medieval history. Edward spent £80,000, roughly equivalent to £56 million today, constructing a ring of fortresses around Snowdonia. Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, Flint, Rhuddlan, Aberystwyth, and Built rose from the Welsh landscape, each one designed to ensure that resistance would never rise again. Conwy Castle was built in just 5 years, consuming more money than the entire English government collected in taxes for a year. Its walls still stand massive and grey, overlooking the estuary where the River Conwy meets the sea. The castle is practically a fortress town, with the 8 massive towers and walls thick enough to resist any siege weapon of the age. Caernarfon was even more impressive. Edward modeled it on the walls of Constantinople, the greatest fortification in Christendom. Its polygonal towers and banded stonework were meant to intimidate and overawe, to tell the Welsh that resistance was not just futile but unthinkable. The castle was never finished, but even incomplete it dominated the landscape. Harlech sits on a rocky promontory overlooking Cardigan Bay, its concentric walls making it virtually impregnable to medieval siege warfare. Beaumaris, begun in 1295, was designed as the perfect geometric fortress, though it too was never completed. These weren't just military installations. They were statements of domination, designed to crush Welsh identity as thoroughly as any battlefield victory. English settlers were brought in to populate new towns built in the shadow of the castles. Welsh people were forbidden from living within the walls, forbidden from carrying weapons, forbidden from gathering in groups. The conquest was to be permanent. And yet, in 1400, a Welsh nobleman named Owain Glyndwr raised the dragon banner and declared himself the true Prince of Wales. The rebellion that followed came closer to success than any since Llywelyn's time. Glyndwr's revolt began as a land dispute with an English neighbor, Reginald Grey of Russin, who had seized property that Glyndwr claimed as his own. When English courts sided with Grey, Glyndwr's followers proclaimed him Prince of Wales on September 16, 1400. What started as a local grievance became a national uprising. By 1404, Glyndwr controlled most of Wales. He captured Harlech and Aberystwyth, two of Edward's great castles. He held parliaments at Machynlleth and drafted plans for Welsh universities and an independent Welsh church. He negotiated alliances with France and Scotland, receiving troops and supplies from both. For a brief, shining moment, Wales was free. Glyndwr proved a brilliant guerrilla leader. He understood the same principles that had guided Caratacus 14 centuries earlier. Never fight in open battle when you can ambush. Never hold ground when you can melt away. Never give the enemy a target they can destroy. For a brief, shining moment, 40 Welsh dukes and nobles stood united under one banner. Then the tide turned. English reinforcements arrived. Welsh castles fell, one by one. A French expedition was repulsed. Scottish support dwindled. By 1409, the revolt was effectively over. Glyndwr retreated into the mountains, into the same landscapes that had sheltered resistance for 1,000 years. He was never captured, he was never killed, he simply vanished, becoming a legend. Multiple locations claim to be his burial site. None can be confirmed. In death as in life, he remained beyond English reach. And that's the pattern. Every conquest of Wales was partial, every submission was temporary. The mountains always provided refuge. The resistance always continued. Even today, the evidence of this unconquerable spirit remains. Welsh is the only Celtic language in Britain that UNESCO doesn't consider endangered. Nearly 30% of the Welsh population speaks it. Children learn it in schools. Signs are written in it. Official documents use it. Television broadcasts in it. Courts operate in it. A language that the Romans tried to erase, that the Normans tried to suppress, that the English made illegal to speak in schools until the 19th century, that centuries of official policy tried to destroy, survives. Not just survives, thrives. The mountains kept the people alive long enough for the culture to survive. There's a reason NATO still uses Welsh terrain for special forces training. The valleys and peaks that broke Roman legions, that exhausted Norman knights, that bled in English armies for generations, still present some of the most challenging terrain in Western Europe. Modern soldiers with helicopters and GPS and satellite communications still struggle in landscapes that ancient warriors knew by heart. The Brecon beacons are used to train special forces from across the world. British SAS candidates face their toughest test in the Welsh mountains. The terrain that defeated empires now tests the elite warriors of the modern age. Wales wasn't conquered. Wales was occupied. And the difference matters. Conquest means the complete subjugation of a people, the erasure of their identity, the replacement of their culture with that of the victors. Rome conquered Gaul, and Gaul became French. Rome conquered Hispania, and Hispania became Spanish. Those places adopted Roman language and Roman custom and Roman law until the original identities were lost. Wales never became English. The language survived, the identity survived. The dragon banner that flew over Glyndwr's camps is the national flag today. The Welsh called their country Cymru and their language Cymrec, not the names their conquerors gave them. 2,000 years of invaders learned the same lesson. You can take the lowlands, you can build your castles, you can install your garrisons and your administrators and your laws, but the mountains remain. And in the mountains, something old and stubborn and utterly unbreakable refuses to die. The greatest empires in history, with the greatest armies in history, with resources beyond imagination and time beyond counting, threw everything they had at a country smaller than Massachusetts. And Wales is still there. The red dragon still flies. Some places cannot be conquered, they can only be endured.